Hello everyone, it's Dr. A. Welcome back to History Surfer for this lecture on the Middle Ages for my art appreciation classes. We'll begin by talking about some of the social and cultural and political aspects of the region, of the era, What we know is after, and this has all been researched, of course, that after the fall of Rome, we have a period of great, it's just everything devolved into chaos, essentially. And so we have all of these small kingdoms forming, and they're all based on tribal relations with the various, what the Romans termed barbarian tribes. We have then also the rise, of course, of the Holy Roman Empire under Charlemagne, and we have the strength of the church being reinforced, and I'm talking about the Roman Catholic Church, and it's reinforced throughout the Middle Ages, and so essentially the church is the, if you want to call a winner of the period, is definitely the Roman Catholic Church. The first semblance of a cohesive political structure that began after the fall of the Roman Empire in the West was under the guidance of Charlemagne. Charlemagne is the founder of the Carolingian Empire, and it's based in this orangey, yellowish area here. It's called the Frankish, he was a Frank, and they call it here the Frankish Empire. Charlemagne was crowned King of the Holy Roman Empire in 800 CE on Christmas Day, endorsed by the Pope, and so he has this control. What Charlemagne does is he consolidates his power by defeating the Muslims, helping to defeat the Muslims. He himself was a warrior king, and he established territories that saw some protection under the Carolingian ruler. His palace was in Aachen, and the Aachen Palace, here you see what it would have looked like. Today, only this part exists here, the Aachen Palace Chapel. Charlemagne was quite aware of the fact that there were precedents set before his arrival onto the scene, if you will, especially by Justinian. And so he will copy the shape of San Vitale in Ravenna to build his palace chapel. And it is roughly equivalent to San Vitale as far as the shape. Also, we have this center of where the worship is, so it's definitely his idea of he's continuing on in the tradition of the the Roman Empire. Aachen Palace Chapel inside, as you can see here, is quite different from San Vitale because it lacks as vibrant the mosaics, but we still do have the use of mosaic in this period. Here, that central focus is this Greek cross plan is seen, and as we look up into the area of the dome, you can see here that desire to copy the old Byzantine style. Here it is, the Christ enthroned here, as well as we have cherubims here, and we see that kind of play out as his idea of, I'm following in the footsteps of Justinian, the Roman Emperor, and I'm endorsed by those ideas. Charlemagne was quite clever in that he did sponsor some buildings in the Carolingian style. And again, he's very conscious of the fact that he's continuing a tradition. And here we see Lorsch Abbey Gate. If you look back into the Roman Empire, the triumphal arches is his model. If we just take off this rather A-frame roof, we have that idea there encapsulated in this opening and this idea. But Lorsch Abbey, this is all that's left. And we know that he possibly had copied some other forms. I'm sure the Basilican form was heavily influential on him. And we also see him endorsing monastic traditions. He built other places, but still, the monastic world was the place where we see the most defined holding over of learning and Byzantine ideas, and especially in the monasteries that were creating books. Cluny Monastery is the biggest monastery of the Middle Ages, and it's here that we definitely have some of the greatest scholars, as well as, if you will, artists working and illuminating manuscripts. The monks who were living in these kind of places, like St. Michael's Mount here, for example, many of them cloistered themselves from the world, and they had time to devote to giving over of their selves to perpetuating the church's doctrine. And one of the ways to do that was definitely to keep, the idea that was contained in the Bible alive. Here we're crossing, we can see they had protected themselves by putting their monastery on an island. This one is off Cornwall in England. And the road here that they built was covered by water during high tide, and so it afforded them some basic form of protection. Monks working in the scriptoriums were copying texts, again, mostly the Bible, but we also see psalters, hymn books, small books of devotion, and these would have been purchased by wealthy people. So this was a source of revenue for the church. You had the person who would write them, and then you had the person who would illuminate them. Illuminated manuscripts are manuscripts that have been pictures. It's the easiest way to put it. The variety of style based on the skill of the artisans is there's tremendous gaps, if you will, between the ancient idea of representational art and this movement in the Middle Ages towards a more abstract art based on some of the influences of the barbarians. Here you see on this illumination, obviously someone who had been influenced by looking at the Greco-Roman style of the past. And in these illuminations, you see pictures that tell stories, like this one here, St. Francis. And you see the apostles, and you see images of Christ. Again, these are varied in their ability. This one, very abstracted, very influenced by the linear quality of the Byzantine. But still, the idea gets across of what the artist wanted to represent. You can see that big forerunner of the halo here that looks more like a sun, but still we're influenced by that Byzantine style of the past. The Book of Kells may be the most famous of the illuminated manuscripts because of its position at Trinity College in Dublin and all of the people who go to see it. But in it, we too can see the marriage of those barbarian styles with the ancient Greco-Roman technique, as well as the techniques of the Byzantines. And the Book of Kells is beautifully done with this very interlaced script. It is just stupendously gorgeous. These are very much loved, these patterns, by the barbarians. And we see them in barbarian art, these interlocking patterns, which become quite a part of the aesthetic of the Middle Ages. So we have three aesthetics that kind of meld together in the would start to meld together in the early Middle Ages. The Greco-Roman tradition, the traditions of the barbarians, and of course the Byzantine. Never forget, the greatest influence on the art of the Middle Ages was definitely the Byzantine style. But here you have a Viking brooch And you can see that beautiful, look at that curling pattern, which locks and then curls back out. Very, very beautiful. It's a fibula. Medieval life was based on the three tenets of feudalism, the Black Plague, and the Crusades. And we have feudalism as a structure for society where we have reciprocity between the different groups of that society. And then when you bring in the spread of the Black Plague, all of Western Europe is impacted. And it certainly does make all of these relationships more important as people became more dependent on their overlords to help them get through these periods. And you can see here how the plague spread. It spread out from China into the West, especially impacting Italy. Islam was also growing, and as one of the two new religions, which I think of that as Christianity and Islam, Christianity spread on the top here in the Mediterranean, and Islam spread on the top of Africa, getting into Iberia and starting a series of crusades. Eventually, they began, you can see here, in 1096, in an attempt to take back the Holy Lands. And so the destination was to go here during the Crusades. Life in the Middle Ages was tough. Towns were not very sanitary. It was a very safe place in a way because you were protected, but it was also a place that a lot of disease flourished. This is underground in Edinburgh. And in an old part of the city, you can see how the streets were. It was a very precarious life for most people. While it looks very picturesque to us today, living like this was very hard. Life expectancy was low. People were very much undernourished for the most part and ripe for plague. I always talk to my students about the sanitary conditions because we can't imagine what it smelled like. With refuge being thrown right into the street, very little bathing happening, this idyllic, idea of, wow, the thatch roof, it looks so pretty. Well, guess what? It wasn't that pretty. With basic amenities that we really do think of as being necessary for life, like, for instance, the bathroom. They have nothing like that. And so we're going to see, even in a beautiful place like Bodiam Castle, that being something that you really didn't have access to a lot of hygienic experiences. Here's the place where what we call the bathroom today, the garderobe then, you would have tended to those needs, but the, everything washed out into the moat. And while these places, again, they're beautiful today, I am always love that romantic feeling when you go to a castle. Certainly, that would have been an unholy smell. Imagine that would have been brimming with all the feces from the castle, and which would have included not just the Lord, but also many of their retainers. Being rich wasn't all that much better. I mean, it was some better. You had better access to food for sure. But certainly the knight in shining armor suffered a lot during the Middle Ages. You can see here, this is the armor of the King of Scotland. That's my husband standing beside him, and definitely shorter than you would imagine, and definitely very different from Hollywood. The halls were big, drafty places. Castles were cold. Castles were built for defense. They were not luxurious palaces. In the High Middle Ages, we began to see the consolidation and expansion of regional states. We have an economic revitalization. Of course, the church remains very strong. And there's contact with other areas beginning in this period. I always think of the the push for movement into Africa, especially out of Portugal. Henry the Navigator sponsored a lot of exploratory trips during this period. The first true style to take hold after the fall of the Roman Empire in the West, while we did see a brief flowering in the Carolingian period, but now a more inclusive style was the Romanesque. So let's talk about the Romanesque style and its characteristics. The Romanesque style is austere. It's basically very plain. There's no adornment on the inside. There's nothing to look at on the inside here. The roof, the vault, if you remember from the architecture lecture, those of you who are in my class, was a very heavy, rounded Roman arch. And without concrete, it was necessary for this to be held up by very thick walls. So that's another characteristic. So we have a plain building, very thick walls, heavy rounded arch, and nothing on the inside, like I said, as far as adornment. Towards the end of the Romanesque period, we'll start to see more sculpture on the exterior, especially around the front door. Okay? Now, always there's exceptions to these rules, and by date, St. Mark's in Venice belongs in the Romanesque period, but certainly it doesn't look very Romanesque. It looks very, very, very ornate. And that's because it was Venice. Venice had a lot of contact with the East, especially Constantinople, and the influence of the Hagia Sophia with the domes, with the windows in it, is quite obvious. When you go into St. Mark's, this is a later image, you're though still entering into a Romanesque structure, because look at the arch. The arches are round, and the Romanesque word means, first of all, sponsored by the Roman Catholic Church, but also Roman-like, referring to the Roman arch. Inside, we have a building that looks Byzantine. And you can see here in the pendentives that beautiful use of mosaic work. It's very, very, very beautiful in St. Mark's. St. Mark's has some of the most spectacular artwork and mosaic work of the period. When you move forward into the building, you're more and more aware of how very Byzantine this is. Again, we see those domes, and those are Byzantine, definitely, with the lights. When I say lights, I mean windows. In architecture, refer to them lights. If we look closely at the Pala d'Oro, that's a screen that's in there, you can see how much the Byzantine influenced the work here at St. Mark's. The attenuated figure of Christ with that very linear quality, as well as that orb of light with the rays coming out of it. He's bearded. He's definitely looks very Byzantine. Unfortunately, for St. Mark's, water has become an issue in recent years. And you can see here during the springtime especially, how much the floods impact the building. This is the tomb of St. Mark. His body was brought back from Alexandria in Egypt, St. Mark the Evangelist, and it was brought here. In fact, some people say it was stolen and then brought back here. But definitely a problem for the structure is that very thing about it that's so awesome that it's on an island and it floats in a lagoon. Not floats, it's in a lagoon. The water that makes Venice so unique also makes Venice susceptible to rising sea levels. It has been bad. While the Venetians are very adaptive people, they know that there are some things that are making this crisis worse, like too many tourists, especially with the incursion of a lot of these cruise ships. They bring too many people here. People, I'm telling you, Venice was my favorite city for a long time. Not anymore. I hate to say that, but it's true. More Romanesque, in its appearance was the original Santiago de Compostela. In northern Spain and in France is where you find the true Romanesque. Now, this church is a big pilgrimage church, and the biggest pilgrimage route was St. James Way. And lots of people came here on pilgrimage. St. James' body was here. He was the person who brought Christianity to Spain. And so it's a revered journey today, still to this day. Of course, the original church was very plain and very Romanesque. It does not look like that today, but I include it because it was such an important building in its period. Here you can see it was added on to, and today it is part of the university there, but still a pilgrimage many people take. But if you look at the bones of the structure, you see here that rounded arch, making it a truly Romanesque building. Inside, it's more true to that nature of the Romanesque with the plain interior, although later these very elaborate retablos were added. And you have these beautiful bundle piers which lead your eye up. And that was the point of these buildings, to make you look up. Up towards the heavens and to feel your own insignificance. It was God who was the most important throughout the Middle Ages. And we don't understand that. We live in a much more secular society, secular, non-religious. But in this period, it was all about that. These buildings were not made with seating. So all the seating that you see is a retrofit. You stood in the presence of God in the Middle Ages. And so with that, we begin to see the decoration of the tympanum area. This area over the header, over the door, this was what's called a lunette. Okay, and everything around it. So there would be sculpture here in the middle, this thing called a trumeau, and over here. The sculpture was the only sculpture available for people to see during the Middle Ages. All sculpture at this point was on architecture. After the fall of the Roman Empire, life-size freestanding sculpture disappeared in the West. Only on architecture do we see it. And these were areas that were foci for the people entering the building, and also there were ceremonies that took place out on the front porch. And so you could see these things and, understand stories that you couldn't read and write. If you were a peasant living in France, say, and this is Vézelay, this is going to mean something more to you than the Bible, because the Bible was written in Latin and you didn't speak Latin or read at all. And you can see that here. It would have been an impressive entrance. Let me put it down so you can see it a little better. That story of judgment of souls here, and all of the evangelists are represented here in their forms that represent them: the lion, the bull, the man, and the eagle. And then here we have Christ, and it is a judgment day, if you will. When we look closely at the imagery that contained within the sculpture, it is not going to be something that you would have seen in, say, Greece. In the ancient Greek tradition, this would have been much more realistic. And again, it depends on where that artisan was trained. Many of these artisans were trained while working with architecture. You had a skill, it kind of showed itself, so they would focus more on producing images. If you look at here on the right, this person was much more influenced by just type of a folk art, if you will. While this person had some influence. This is on, by the way, the same building. This is at Santiago de Compostela. This person had some influence from the Byzantine world, and we can see that in, again, the attenuation of the body, as well as those linear folds. In painting, there was not a lot of secular stuff. We're mostly going to see religious work, and we see that image of Christ based on what we had seen in the Byzantine period, and he's surrounded here by the tetramorph, the evangelists, again, their representation, their symbols, and we see him having here that gesture of blessing. It is very much about the Byzantine and its influence on the artisans of the period. We are definitely on a breakthrough, though, when we get to the Gothic period.